So we are on our next setup text in the Gospel of Luke. Luke's account of like the Jesus story. And you may be wondering, when on earth are we going to get to like Jesus preaching? Well, this is the last one, the last setup one. The weeks to come, we'll talk about some of the teachings. It's so easy to go right past these setup stories because we want to get right into the action. But then when we do that, we miss what our writer is trying to do, and that is to establish a context for understanding what Jesus is up to and what God is up to, according to our writer's perspective. So I'm going to recap some of those right now. First, we have the divine conception story, right? What is that telling us about Jesus? Well, to our author, Jesus has godly stuff in him. Jesus is, at the very least, a demigod. Like Alexander the Great, like Caesar Augustus, like Hercules. We ought to be paying attention. He's got divinity within him. Next thing that our writer establishes is that the deity, the God that Jesus has as his divine parent, it's not any of those other ones. It's the Yahweh El God of the Hebrew Bible. And we see that in a couple of different areas where God says, either through an angel or directly, that Jesus is his son. So Jesus has a special relationship with the God of Israel. That's one of the points our writer's trying to make. That's going to become relevant in a moment. Another point our writer's trying to make is that Jesus is connected to royalty. He is born in the town of Bethlehem, David's hometown. He has the lineage that connects him to David, but also lineage that connects him all the way back to Adam. So he's connected to monarchy. He's also connected to humanity. He's humanity's demigod, at the very least. And then we've got Mary's Magnificat. Mary presents kind of a thesis statement for us. What is God doing through Jesus? Well, to Mary, God is bringing down the powerful and the wealthy and bringing up the poor and the powerless and the hungry. We have a leveling of the worlds. All of this is supposed to help how we see Jesus when he enters the scene. This is very different than how Mark approaches it, because Mark approaches it just by like, here's Jesus, right? Our very first time meeting Jesus, he's already preaching. I bring you good news, the kingdom of God is near. That's his gospel message, and that's how we meet Jesus. Luke's like, okay, before we even get to that, I want to lay all of this other groundwork. And then we get this story, the temptation of Jesus. Now, I think the temptation part is really more us than Jesus in this story. I mean, it's testing at the very least, and the word for temptation could also be translated as testing. None of these seem to be all that enticing to Jesus, at least the way our writer's presenting it, right? If this is a test, he passes. He gets an A+. If it's a temptation, I don't know. We never enter his mindset to see like, oh, golly, that looks so good. I've not eaten all day. We've got these cookies. I think that's how a lot of us enter this story. So this happens right after John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. The point being, with that account, is that Jesus is connected to John the Baptist's ministry. And John the Baptist's ministry emphasizes repenting of exploiting people, hurting people for your own selfish gain. Another building block. And then Jesus receives the Holy Spirit in the baptism. This is just like other messiahs would receive, other anointed ones, like the kings and the prophets. Only the kings and the prophets were anointed with oil that symbolized that God's Spirit was with them. Here we just get water and the Spirit. And what does the Spirit do? After God says, "You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased," to Jesus, the Spirit takes Jesus out into the wilderness, out into the wild areas. And he spends 40 days wandering around. It's a time of preparation for him. Our Bible writers often like to use this number 40. It kind of points to like an absolute time, this intensive period of prep. And during these 40 days, he doesn't eat anything. And as you can imagine, he gets a little peckish. And this is when the diabolical one, that's how you literally translate the word that we call devil, he encounters the devil. This is the first time in the book of Luke that we meet the devil. This is not a character we see much in the Hebrew Bible, if ever. We get some characters that are kind of like proto-diabolical ones, but by the time we get to the first century, it's a more fleshed out persona. Now, I don't believe in a literal devil. I'm getting ahead of myself. But I do believe in a literary devil. And I think this literary devil presents us with a powerful juxtaposition. You see, if you've got the embodiment of evil in your story, and you've got this leadership figure whom your movement follows, you probably want to see where they agree and disagree, right? Hey, is our leader in league with evil? Kind of a good question. Luke's perspective is no. Well, we should see what these temptations are, these tests. The first one is for Jesus to transform stone into a loaf of bread. If you are the Son of God, prove it. Transform this stone into a loaf of bread. And Jesus says, well, Scripture says, we don't live off of bread alone. We live off of every thought of God. Now, you might be wondering what exactly is going on here. Certainly, Jesus would be within his rights to eat after 40 days, right? Our writer's trying to make a point here. What kind of leader is Jesus going to be? Is Jesus going to be the insecure kind of leader that so many of us are used to? Who, when challenged by another person, has to prove who they are? Prove you're the Son of God. Jesus feels no need to prove that he's the Son of God to the devil. Transform this bread. You have needs, Jesus. You've got wants. Are you going to be the kind of leader who uses their power to satisfy themselves? That's the point of this. It's not that eating is bad. This isn't like breatharianism or something. If you want to know what that's a reference to and you don't, talk to me afterwards. It's not got nothing to do with that. It's got everything to do with presenting us with a Jesus who doesn't use his power to satisfy himself. I'm going to skip to the third temptation, and then we'll come back to the second one. I know that's going to mess with some of us who are like, no, it goes 1, 2, 3, not Not 132, but I've got a method to the madness, I promise. Temptation number 3, the devil wisps them, that was a terrible snap, wisps them away to the top of the temple. And he says, once again, if you are the Son of God, prove it, throw yourself down from the temple, because it is written, Jesus isn't the only one who can quote the Bible, so can the devil. It is written that God will protect you. God won't let you smash your heel against the rocks. God will send an angel to keep you from getting hurt. Jesus says, it's also written, don't put your Lord to the test. Don't do that. This is an interesting setting. Once again, we've got this positioning of Jesus, not as insecure leader who has to prove himself to his opponents. But we also have a Jesus who refuses to use spectacle and the backgrounds of the religious institution for his gain. This is one of the more controversial points I'm going to make today. We can't just trust that leaders who come touting their religious credentials truly represent what Jesus was about, because Jesus never touted that. Jesus talked a lot about religion, that's true. He talked a lot about the way of wisdom as he saw it. But we so easily forget that he was on the outs with the most powerful religious institution of his day, the temple and the Sadducees, those who ran it. Yes, he would get into conflict with the Pharisees as well, but it was the Sadducees who had most of the power. And Jesus forsakes it. He doesn't need that. I think we ought to be a lot more skeptical when we see religious leaders claiming to represent the religion, the truth, the institution that we all ought to be respecting. This brings us back to the second temptation. And I've saved this one for last because I think it's the most pertinent today. The devil takes Jesus up to this high point, the highest point in the world, where he could see all the kingdoms of the earth. We need to remember this is literature, because if you try to make this a rational thing that's happening, it's not going to work. It'll be bonkers, okay? You go to the top of Mount Everest, you're not going to see all the kingdoms of the world. That's not how that works. So let's go back into the story space, right? Here's all the kingdoms of the world, Jesus. If you submit to me, I will grant you glory and authority over them, because I can put people into power wherever I want. Notice that Jesus doesn't argue with him in this. This is a perspective that existed in the first century, that maybe many of the kingdoms of the world are evil, in league with the devil. Jesus doesn't hem and haw around this. Jesus doesn't say, well, you know, God's the one ultimately in control of all of this. All he says, it is written to worship God alone. He's saying, I'm going to submit to God, and that's it. Why have I saved this one for last? Because I think of all the devilish temptations that have faced the church and Christians, this is the one we keep falling into. It happens before Caesar Constantine. Back when the church was hoping to become more respectable in the eyes of Roman society, they started kicking out lot of their women leaders. So much so that most of us don't know that even in the time that the New Testament was being formed, we had female leaders. Paul recognizes them. One of them is a female apostle. But before Constantine comes in, many of them are given the boots, because in that immensely patriarchal society, many of the Christians came to see that as a bit of a shameful thing. We see that with Constantine, who tells the church, you guys need to get your act in gear, and you need to make sure everybody conforms in what they believe around your religion. So that's what they do. We see this after Constantine. We see this with the Roman Empire, many of the leaders who come after him, and then the Holy Roman Empire with Charlemagne, convert or die was his policy. We see this with the Spanish Inquisition. We see this with popes and anti-popes. We see this with reformers. We see this with kings throughout Europe. Henry VIII started his own denomination so that the church would be more friendly to him. We see this with American colonies and American religion. And we're seeing it today. Christian nationalism is having a day. In its quest for supremacy, it has made this compromise. It has chosen the path of the devil by attempting to secure and shore up power. I keep hearing that we've got somebody in the White House now who's been divinely ordained by God. How wonderful for us. That's how you talk about kings. It's not how you talk about presidents. A colleague of mine, some of you may have heard him in the past. David Libby, co-pastor of another church out here in Portland, received a letter from ICE. David said that his church was going to be a sanctuary for any who need it. And so the director of ICE in our area wrote him, chastised him, told him he's got an arrest warrant coming, that they're going to keep an eye on his church. And also chastised him for being a Christian leader who doesn't want to follow the laws of the land. Because we just assume if it's the law of the land, it must be good, or we must follow it. And yet I keep thinking about King, Martin Luther King Jr., who had to tell us, and still has to tell us, over and over again, just because it's the law doesn't mean it's just. When we have leaders claiming to follow Christ, we need to be paying attention to what they're trying to sell us on. Are they trying to sell us on peace and justice? Is that what they're concerned with? Because that's the kind of stuff Jesus was concerned with. Are they talking about love? Love of God, love of neighbor, love of yourself? What do they have to say about people in power? What do they have to say about wealth? Do they have an agenda that is compatible with Mary's Magnificat? That those cursed with too much may have less, and those cursed with not enough may have more. Or is that too radical for them? More importantly, is that too radical for us? Who are we? Who do we seek to follow? Who are we going to claim? Is it going to be Jesus? Or is it going to be the devil? Now, I might not believe in a literal devil, but I do believe in evil. And I see a great many evil happening right now. And if you've been wondering, is it okay? Are you the crazy one? It's not okay. And no, you're not the crazy one. You've got God pulling us towards healing and wholeness and peace and love and mercy. You've got Jesus living those things out in our sacred text. And we've got those claiming them, claiming God and Jesus, trying to get us as a nation and as individuals to do the opposite. Now, I had more I was going to say on this, but I couldn't get the sermon to print again. And my tablet has frozen. But I think this is as good a spot to end as any. I invite you to stand for our responsive song. And if you'd like to talk about this more, please do not hesitate to reach out to me after the service.